While you no longer have to count how many marbles are in a jar, or you may not have to recite all 67 counties in Alabama, we still have modern-day forms of voter suppression. And we House Democrats say no, no more. We have a bill, H.R. 4, which will fully restore the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and we are proud to be supportive of it. The November 2018 elections, midterm elections, showed just how urgent the need is to protect our right to vote. Most striking was in Georgia. The Republican candidate for governor used his powers as Secretary of State to put over 53,000 voter registrations on hold. Why? Infractions as simple as missing a hyphen in a name and a name ID kept Americans from casting their ballots in November. Despite the modern-day efforts for voter suppression, like in Georgia and Alabama and across this nation, we as Democrats have put forward H.R. 4, the Voting Rights Advancement Act. And with the help of all of you, we will put it on the floor and we will pass it. We have to make sure, yes, we have to make sure that the Republicans know that it's unacceptable that in 2019 they're not supporting voting rights. What has changed since 2006 when so many Republicans joined us Democrats in passing the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and reauthorizing it for 25 more years? Despite these efforts, House Democrats have remained steadfast in our efforts to honor this promise. We will pass H.R. 4, and we dare the Republicans to join us in making sure that every American has the right to vote. Next, we will hear from Speaker Nancy Pelosi, no one has been more of a fierce advocate for the right to vote and to restore the Voting Rights Act of 1965 than our Speaker, Nancy Pelosi.
Thank you very much, Terry Sewell, for your strong leadership on behalf of the United States of America. As we go forward to this next period of time, as we celebrate the 4th of July, we want to celebrate liberty and justice for all, and that means everyone having access to the vote. It was a few years ago that many of us stood on the steps of the Supreme Court when they heard the arguments in the Shelby versus Holder case. The Black Caucus led the way for us that day. And then a few years later, a short time later, that day, by the way, I think it's interesting to note, my colleagues, that day we went to the steps of the Supreme Court to speak out for voting rights in our country. And then we crossed the street and came to the Capitol and dedicated a statue to Rosa Parks that would appear in the Capitol of the United States. Our Republican colleagues did not see any challenge to their conscience to think that they should be, if they're honoring Rosa Parks, they should be joining us in the arguments before the court, but they didn't. But nonetheless, the court came down with its decision in 2013. Today, we mark the 6th anniversary of Shelby versus Holder, a most unfortunate decision. But John Lewis, who will speak next, our champion, our hero, our icon, he was part of writing that bill that they struck parts of it down. He was part of when we stood on the steps, as Terry Sewell said. We came down those steps in a bipartisan way with overwhelming support in the House and the Senate for the Voting Rights Act. I walked down with Senator Frist, the majority leader in the Senate at the time. And yet the court said we did not have a strong enough constitutional basis, so here we are. I want to join Terry Sewell in commending the groups who are here with us, all of our members who are here, and you'll be hearing from some of them. But this is very important. This is about patriotism for America. It's about the right to vote, the sacred privilege contained in our Constitution, hard fought for, amended into law, and something we will not let them take away from us, the legitimacy of America. And we have no stronger champion in that regard, and no deeper inspiration, no stronger fighter for all of that than the distinguished gentleman from Georgia, Mr. John Lewis.
Yay! Thank you,
Thank you, Madam Speaker, for those kind words. I've said this before, and I will say it again. The vote is precious. It is almost sacred. It is the most powerful, non-violent tool we have in a democracy. There are forces in this country that want to keep American citizens from having a rightful say in the future of our nation. That's why the VRA was gutted. We have to change that. We must change it, and we will. Congress must change it. We have the power, and we must do all we can on our own watch, in our own time, to make sure the work of democracy continues in this country. I'm deeply and very concerned about the future of our democracy. Seems like the lights are about to go out. We must have the capacity and the ability to redeem the soul of this nation and set it on the right course. We must do all we can to make this nation where justice and the voice of the people prevail. Now it is my delight and great pleasure to present a young man from the great city of New York, Jerry Nadler. Thank you,
Chairman of the House, Judiciary.
Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, John. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 is one of the most effective civil rights statutes that was ever enacted into law. 6 years ago today, however, the Supreme Court issued its disastrous decision in Shelby County versus Holder and thereby effectively gutted the Act's central enforcement provision known as the preclearance requirement. Before the Voting Rights Act, states and localities routinely passed voter suppression laws, secure in the knowledge that it could take many years before the laws could be successfully challenged in court, if at all. As soon as one law was overturned by the courts, another would be enacted, essentially setting up a discriminatory game of whack-a-mole. Section 5's preclearance provision broke this legal logjam and helped to stop this discriminatory practice. The success of the VRA with its effective preclearance requirement was apparent almost immediately, with registration of African American voters more than doubling in the South within just 4 years of enactment. By striking down the formula for determining which states and localities are subject to the preclearance requirement, the Shelby County decision effectively suspended the operation of the preclearance requirement itself, and in its absence, the game of whack-a-mole has returned with a vengeance. Since the Shelby County decision, we have seen the emergence of other voter suppression measures, like burdensome proof of citizenship laws, significant scalebacks to early voting periods, restrictions on absentee ballots, and laws that make it difficult to restore the voting rights of formerly incarcerated individuals, and many others. These kinds of voting practices have a very disproportionate negative impact on minority voters, and they are intended to. In the most recent elections in November of 2018, voters across the country encountered barriers to voting from state and local laws and circumstances that made it hard or even impossible to vote. For example, in Georgia, as was already mentioned, 53,000 voter registrants, 70% of whom were African American, were placed in pending status by the Secretary of State because of minor misspellings on their voter registration forms. While it is true that those seeking to enforce the Voting Rights Act can still pursue after-the-fact legal remedies, even without preclearance, time and experience have proven that such an approach takes far longer, is far more expensive than having an effective preclearance regime. And once a vote has been denied, it cannot be recast. The damage to our democracy is permanent. That is why we hope that members on both sides of the aisles, in both chambers of Congress, will come together and pass legislation to restore the Voting Rights Act and its preclearance requirement to full vitality. Today, the House Judiciary Subcommittee on the Constitution is holding a hearing to provide an important opportunity to renew our understanding of the importance of the Voting Rights Act and its preclearance provision, and to support our efforts to craft a legislative solution. We pledge that before the year is out, we will pass a new Voting Rights Act renewal with a new preclearance requirement that will again make voting the sacred right that it is and give it effective enforcement. Thank you.
Now the subcommittee chair of Constitution on the Judiciary Committee, Steve Cohen.
Thank you. We will be having a hearing after votes, and our primary witness will be Stacey Abrams. Stacey Abrams was the victim of much of what Georgia did to restrict the vote, and it was done intentionally to limit the African American vote and to not elect a Democrat, and particularly an African American woman. The person who was most responsible for implementing those laws and taking people off the voting rolls was the Secretary of State in Georgia, who happened to be Stacey Abrams' opponent and is now the beneficiary of all those nefarious actions, serving as governor of the state of Georgia. That was not an accident, it was intentional. The disparate impact upon African Americans has been going on in the South since the Civil War. Too many people in the South believe in the song Dixie, old times there are not forgotten, and old traditions there aren't forgotten either. And it's about keeping black people down. And that's what they have effectively done with these changes in laws to change voting places, to change days of voting, to have photo IDs, and all other kind of laws to limit the impact of African Americans and voting in the South. There's no reason why the Voting Rights Act should have been struck down. The last time we had it up for renewal, the Democrats had a position that to be a co-sponsor of the bill, you had to bring a Republican along with you. That was about the same time as the Malaysian airplane went missing in the South Indian Ocean. Well, there were about 4 Republicans on the bill then, and I worked the Republican side very, very hard to find a friend to be a co-sponsor. It would have been easier for me to go to the South Indian Ocean and find that airplane. The Republicans weren't there then. I'm afraid they won't be there now. And we've heard what Mitch McConnell has done as the grim reaper of the place for the death of House bills in the Senate, and he praised the fact that we didn't need reparations because we'd elected a black president, who he immediately said should not serve a second term. I don't think that Mitch McConnell will give us what we need to have in the Senate, an equal hearing, to give all Americans the right to vote and make us the more perfect union that we're supposed to be. Thank you.
We'll now hear from the chair of the Voting Rights Caucus, Mark Vesey from Texas.
Representative Sewell, thank you very much. My dear colleague, John Lewis, Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, everyone that is here today for coming to listen to us talk about the importance of today. My name is Mark Vesey. I represent the Fort Worth, Dallas area, and we're here to mark a grim anniversary, but I don't call it an anniversary. It's a nightmare. It's a nightmare that we revisit every 6 years. Because that's how long it's been since the Supreme Court struck down the critical provisions of the Voting Rights Act that bolstered fair practices and gave minority communities a voice at the ballot box. This week, we could see the Supreme Court mark the 6th anniversary of this decision again by deciding to silence the voice of millions if they allow a citizenship question to be added on the 2020 census. In Dallas alone, in this man's notes that were found, and thank God they were found, it said that they could eliminate 1.7 state legislative districts that were Latino districts if they were able to add this question onto the census. Now, what do you think that is all about? Everyone deserves a fair chance in our democracy, no matter what the color of their skin is. And we are fighting to preserve voting rights for all Americans. No one should be staying home on Election Day. We've got to use our rights before we lose them. And we have to continue to fight just as hard to defend our voting rights as our predecessors fought to earn them. Keep the fight up.
Now our Assistant Speaker, Ben Ray Lujan from the great state of New Mexico.
Thank you, Terry. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Terry, it's an honor to be with you today, and